With Chapter 8, we'll be looking at joints that we find in the skeletal system and trying to understand how joints are constructed and how they function. And so with this first lecture, we'll be talking a little introductory material and then looking at one way of organizing or grouping joints based on how they function. So joints are the bone-to-bone or bone-to-cartilage connections that we find in the skeleton. And there are multiple functions for the joint. They first hold bones, or not necessarily tightly together, but they can hold bones together and keep them in their appropriate relationship to each other. And they are the spots in the skeletal system where we can move or allow for movement in the very rigid skeletal system. Joints can be the region that allows for bone growth, and they permit the skeletal parts to change shape as the body grows and develops. So a number of ways that the bones or the joints are useful to the body. So when we think about joints, we can group them based on two different, or in two different ways. We can classify them based on their function, looking at primarily how much movement the joint allows. And there are three functional classifications. There's a synarthrosis, and arthur, by the way, that root word means joint, and syn would be together. Synarthroses are immovable joints. Amphiarthroses, those are slightly movable joints, while diarthroses are the very movable joints. They allow quite a lot of flexibility and freedom of motion. We can also classify joints based on their structure, what they're composed of, how it is that the two bones are held together. And if we look at that system of classification, then we again see three categories. The fibrous joints, which are held together by connective tissue that has a high amount of protein fibers in it. The cartilaginous joints, which are held together because of the cartilage that binds them together. And then last of all, the synovial joints, which are the joints that have a capsule around them. They have a fibrous connective tissue capsule that surrounds them. And the interior of that connective tissue capsule is lined with a synovial membrane, which, if you recall from back in the tissues chapter, synovial membranes are capable of secreting synovial fluid, of a lubricating fluid, into the joint. So we're going to first look at the functional classifications in this lecture. And we'll start by looking at the synarthroses. A synarthrosis, again, that is an immovable joint, and there are a number of examples of them throughout the body. The sutures that we see between the bones of the skull and also in the facial bones, those sutures are synarthroses. So here's the joint, highly, a very elaborate joint. It's highly folded. It allows for a lot of surface area for connection, but it is not a movable joint. A tooth fitting into its socket is a second example of one of these synarthroses. And then if we look at the sternum and how it connects to the first pair of ribs, not to the more inferior ribs, but that first pair of ribs is a synarthrosis. And then finally, down at the distal ends of the tibia and the fibula, there is an interosseous membrane, fibrous connective tissue membrane, that holds the two bones together, and that's a synarthrosis as well. So all of these joints are joints that are built in a way that they don't allow movement. Amphiarthroses permit some movement, and the joints that we find between the adjacent vertebrae. So here's the body of the vertebra here in this X-ray, and then here's the cartilage pad that is on either side of that vertebra, creating its joint to either the vertebra below or the vertebra above. Those are amphiarthroses because they allow some flexion between those two vertebrae. So a little bit of movement. Amphi means two sides. If somebody is ambidextrous, then they can use both sides. So there's a little side-to-side movement allowed with an amphiarthrosis. And the symphysis pubis, that layer of, or that mass of connective tissue that binds the pubic bones together, that is another amphiarthrosis. And it allows a little bit of flexibility there, especially after the enzymes that a woman produces as she approaches childbirth loosen up the fibers that are there in that fibrous connective tissue. So an amphiarthrosis, a little bit of movement. And then finally, the diarthroses are the fully movable, the very mobile joints. And all of the diarthroses possess a joint capsule. So to be a fully movable or freely movable joint, a joint capsule must be around it, allowing for that significant amount of movement. And so a number of the joints of the body are diarthrotic joints. The temporomandibular joint, that's the joint there at the mandible and the temporal bone of the skull that allows the lower jaw to both descend and to ascend. That is a diarthrotic joint. All the joints that are found in the appendages are diarthrotic. The joint at the femur and the tibia, down, both above and below the joints that they're at the top of the tibia, at the proximal. It took me a second to get it out there, but the proximal portion of the tibia and the distal portion of the femur. The joints between the sternum and the clavicle, the sternoclavicular joint, and then the joints between the sternum and the ribs, all the way down, number 2 through 7, are all diarthrotic joints. Okay, so there we have it. Quite a few diarthroses in the body. So you're introduced a little bit to the function of joints, and then this functional classification system of synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, and diarthrosis.